understanding why ZANU-PF is staying in power. They get us closer to understanding why rural voters are likely to show up and vote, right? In 2008, after the election, people were given an option. Do you want short sleeve or long sleeve, right? That's what happened for that runoff election. And so the violence can motivate people to vote for the ruling party. That's true. Another explanation for ZANU-PF survival is that, well, they were rigging elections and stuffing ballots. So we can think about, well, maybe they are double counting almost every election. And I've gone back home to vote since I came to the US. So I came to the US in 2005 as an undergrad, and I've returned home to vote every election. And when they're announcing elections, we always get to this one region of the country where the announcers kind of chuckle. And then they give you, well, the votes from here, 200,000 for the ruling party. And everybody laughs because we're all thinking, really, in Uzumba, 200,000. And after the last, the 28 election, my friends and I, we drove to Uzumba just to get a sense of a place that gives you 200,000 votes should feel like a place that is 200,000 people, right? It should have the activity, the energy of a place with 200,000 people. But you get there and there is no energy or feel of 200,000 people. So maybe there is something about the rigging, right? That ZANU-PF is consistently rigging elections. In my own work, I've also written about the nostalgia, right? That some people vote for ZANU-PF because this is the party of independence. This is the party that brought an end to colonial rule. And whether or not, my grandparents are often like, you people, you undermine the cruelty of colonial rule. So perhaps our generation does that and older generations don't do that, right? So they remember what colonialism was like. And so perhaps there's a little bit of that, right? This voting for ZANU-PF, this nostalgia. There's a really beautiful picture, which I don't include in the book because I didn't have the money to buy the rights for the picture, but it's after independence and there's women dancing at a rally and one of them jumps up high. And I think about that euphoria, right? The joy of independence. So that might be influencing votes. In political science, we think, well, political parties also win if the economy is doing well. But the economy in Zimbabwe hasn't done well for a long time, right? Another memory from childhood is that a relative of ours visits our home and leaves me with $2 in 1997. It's a $2 bill. So I was a very naughty child. So I look at the $2 bill and I think, oh, there's a line in the middle there. So I pull out the line. And then my mother comes back home. And instead of focusing on the fact that this was my money, she gets upset. Oh, you know what we could have done with that $2? We could have bought bread, milk, etc., etc. By the time I'm leaving for the United States, I go for my visa interview. I think I paid something like 4,000 Zimbabwean dollars in the morning for a taxi. When I'm going back home, the $4,000 isn't enough anymore. It's inflation. The price has doubled. Maybe some of you drive. Maybe the price of fuel is gone up. I don't know. I don't drive. I walk. Maybe the price of fuel has gone up. But also, I think Americans are really whining because American fuel is at the bottom of the price. I think it's still like $1 per liter in the US, whereas everybody else is already paying $2. But you get it, inflation. Or maybe an example that makes sense to the young people in the room is that Netflix just doubled their prices. This is something that matters to me. So Netflix just doubled. I think it's now, they're going for $14 a month or something like that. That's inflation, right? So in the last 20 years, the Zimbabwean economy has not done well. And therefore, we shouldn't expect ZANU-PF to be getting votes because of the economy. The inflation is terrible. We've had 3 different currencies in the last, or maybe 4. We've had 3 different currencies in the last 15 years. 3 different ones. We've used everything, right? So the economy is not doing well. So what else is it? And for me, I think that a lot of people that study African politics get caught up in these traditional explanations: violence, war, rigging, right? That it didn't allow people to really think beyond that something else could be happening, right? And so that's where my work comes in. And I say to myself, I think the fact that these voters have left, right? So the opposition in 2000 is the strongest opposition we've ever had in Zimbabwe. It's brought together black and white Zimbabweans, which matters in Zimbabwe. It's brought together people across the regions, right? So the southern regions and the northern regions, people across tribe. There is a lot of support for the opposition, and yet they just can't cross over that line, right? So the rigging, yes. The violence, yes. But what else is costing the opposition? So when I interview people abroad, so after my little survey failed, I took some anthropology classes. I don't know if there are any anthropologists in the room. Thank you. Political scientists, we're not great at ethnographic work. And, one of the reviewers kept pushing back on me and saying, I don't like that you're throwing political scientists under the bus for ethnography. And I said, I have to be honest, I was not trained to do ethnography by political scientists. I was trained by anthropologists. And so I look at all these maps of where have Zimbabweans gone, and I narrow it down to the research would focus on 4 countries. So I would spend time in the United States, in the UK, in South Africa, and then I would also interview Zimbabweans that had gone back home. But it's tricky, right? How do I find these Zimbabweans? So I start off in the US, and I wanted a lot of distance between myself and the people that I was interviewing. And the places that we know where Zimbabweans tend to go, I had always been told there are more Zimbabweans in Dallas, and the data seemed to suggest that. So I conduct a number of my first interviews in Dallas. But the methodology takes me to Indiana, right, which was a surprise to me. But it turns out that even predating the crisis in 2000, a lot of immigrants would move to places in the Midwest because the Midwest is a place that has always needed labor. So their regulations, requirements regarding who can work are very different. In fact, I kicked off the book tour in January in Indiana. And one of the things that struck me when I was there is that the conversations about ICE were very different, right? So people seemed to be suggesting that the farmers in Indiana have an agreement with the government that we need labor. We need people to work here. So I would spend some time in Indiana, which also became very helpful because if you can tell from my name, I'm Shona, and I needed to be able to reach a lot of non-Shona populations. And in Indiana, I was able to do that. So I spent some time in Indiana. I also follow Zimbabwean organizations back in Oregon, where I studied my journey in the United States as an undergraduate in Oregon. And then I would spend time in Washington, D.C. and Atlanta. And then I went to the UK, where we actually have a good stock of Zimbabweans that were there. So of course I started in London, but nobody arrives and stays in London because London is very expensive. So I follow the migrants all the way through Manchester, Birmingham, or then I get to Scotland. And because, I don't know, I was in grad school, I wasn't really thinking straight. I didn't realize that you don't go to Scotland in January. So I get to Scotland in January and it's freezing. And I end up being stuck in this couple's house for about 2 days. And they say to me, you've been asking us all these questions. What is our voting preference? Do we send money back home? What is it that you're interested in? And I say, well, what I'm interested in is, what does it mean that people have left? And she said, ask me again. What are you interested in? I said, well, I want to know how voter exit impacts support for the opposition. How does it change the votes that they would get? How does it change protest movement, citizen demand, citizen voice? And so we restart the conversation, and I would learn some things that I'll talk a little bit about later on. But for the Zimbabwean diaspora, the biggest impact of their exit is this. Zimbabwe does not allow for external voting, right? So in the US, we're talking a lot right now about mail ballot voting, and I believe the president doesn't like it, even though he uses it himself. So Zimbabwe doesn't have that. Once you've left Zimbabwe, you cannot vote from abroad. I understand that Kenya just allowed external voting for the diaspora. I don't know if we've got any Kenyans in the room. So there are a few countries in Africa that allow, but most countries do not allow you to vote from abroad. So it means that for a Zimbabwean, the moment you've left your ex behind. So all those votes will not be counted. Number two, once people left, so there were a number of things happening with the immigrants, right? So there's a group, so in South Africa, I was able to interview a lot more white Zimbabweans, which is a group that was critical to me. White Zimbabweans are critical because their citizenship, not just for white Zimbabweans, but also for Black farmers, farm workers in Zimbabwe. In 2002, the Citizenship Act would strip people of their citizenship. If you're a white Zimbabwean or anybody who had origins that the government said did not belong to the country, you lost your Zimbabwean citizenship unless you were willing to denounce whatever citizenship they said they had. But it's 2002. Who's going to denounce a British citizenship, right? Now you get a free passport to go to the UK. You're not going to denounce that, right? So for those people, prior to 2013, we didn't have dual citizenship. So anybody who lost their citizenship during that point would not be able to participate in elections. And so this has a huge impact, particularly on white Zimbabweans and anybody else, right? Where the government said you had heritage from outside of Zimbabwe. So that's a second group that's no longer able to participate in elections. But even for Zimbabweans who could keep their citizenship, many people that leave because of the violence, they claim asylum abroad. You claim asylum, you can't go back home. As an asylee, you can't vote. So in the book, I walk you through all the data on asylees that I could find. So these are all the people that are no longer able to vote. But even if you could, right? So you're like me, or you've got dual citizenship, whatever the case is, you live in the United States. The last election, it cost me over $6,000 just to be able to vote. And that's the tricky part for the diaspora. Most people work so they can send money back home. Many people are not willing to spend thousands of dollars to return home to vote. It's too expensive, right? And so the money issue comes up. So I start thinking to myself, well, what is this additional impact of these remittances, right? So people are working so hard. In fact, in England, people were telling me that when they first got there in the early 2000s, they would earn, let's say, £100 that week, keep £20 for themselves, send £80 back home. They stay in a room, 4 people to a room, 6 people to a room, so that they could send money back home. And the government was cognizant of that. So in 2004, before I came to the US, a good friend of mine had received money for her ticket via Western Union. At the time, the government had shut down Western Union because they imagined that Zimbabweans might be willing to channel money through the government's coffers, right? But people didn't want to do that. So then the government says, okay, Western Union come back, but there are hefty taxes on Western Union. So when you're sending money to Africa and other developing parts of the world, you pay almost 10 times more than sending money to any other region in the world. So now the government is making remittances a part of their annual budget, right? So they can budget that money that they don't create jobs for, and they can tax that money. So later on, the government would include a 2% tax. Every single item you buy in Zimbabwe has an additional 2% tax. But more than that, what these remittances do is that they scaffolds the government from providing welfare. So in the book, I write about someone whom I interviewed whose father was sick. They get to the hospital. The hospital says, we cannot treat him unless you pay the full amount up front. Says, we don't have it. They said, you have somebody in the diaspora. See, by the time the person is sending the money from abroad, it's too late. His father has died because of time difference. So now things have changed. The hospital will say, well, we have Western Union right here in the hospital. We don't have to wait. As soon as we get that notification, we can treat your person. Schools are doing the same thing. You can remit directly to the school, right? So I interview somebody who's sending money for their child to go to a private school. And I would forward the money. So I would interview the person in England who's saying, or the US or wherever. They would say, I'm sending so much money back to my family. And I would follow the money back to Zimbabwe just to verify, I want to know, you said you send $1,000. I want to know, where's the $1,000 going? So in this particular case, it was quite sad actually, because I get to the family, I interview the mother who receives the money. She tells me exactly what she gets every month and how the money trickles down, right? So this is the other important thing about the remittances. There's one person who gets the money, but often that money is helping 10, 12 more people. But in this case, and I don't include this in the book, but I did think about writing about it. So she's sending money for private school for her kid. She asks me to take a picture of the child. I take a picture of the child. I send it back to her. She calls me crying. I say, oh, what have I done? What is happening? She says, that's not the private school uniform. So I asked the mother. She says it's not the private school uniform. The mother says, yes. But if I were to pay private school for her one child, what do I do with the other orphans that are in the home? So yes, we did buy the private school uniform and we did send her pictures for the private school uniform, but the child is not in private school because she's sending this money for the private school, but I have other 5 children to think about. And I'll come back to why this matters. But now the remittances. So now the government has scaffolded, right? This government that at some point had $200 or whatever Tendai said, has $200 in its bank account, but there are billions coming in through from the diaspora, almost $4 billion a year that the government is able to budget. But there's something else that people are remitting back. So when I look at literature from Mexico and India, for example, we talk about people being able to remit democracy along with the money that's going there. But in Zimbabwe, it was usually, see, now I feel bad because there's a Zimbabwean man in the room, but men were not sending money as consistently as women. women document how much they were sending. So I interviewed a woman, we had all her Western Union receipts from 2000, right? So we're able to go through all this very rich data. So women document what they send for, but women are also remitting something else, especially the ones who had children, children that could participate in politics, children that could vote. They are remitting caution. They're saying to their children, if I send you money, then I don't want to see you on the streets protesting. Because they are cognizant of the violence. And I keep hearing this over and over. And I go, and one of the most interesting things is each time I would vote in Zimbabwe, so I live in Harare North, and we vote, and the lines in Harare North are shorter. The election is over by midday, right? In the wealthier parts of the city, it's not very wealthy. I say everybody in Zimbabwe is poor, it's the upper poor, if you will, right? But the election is over quite quickly. Who is not voting, right? It's this group of the middle class. They're not voting because many of them have access to remittances. They're also not voting because, well, who am I accountable to? The government doesn't do anything for me. My mother sends money from abroad. But also, my mother doesn't want me to protest. Listen, my mother, I don't know how she's still 74 because I have given her much grief. In 2008, I left college in Oregon, flew to Zimbabwe for a protest, and flew back to school. Says, what are we doing in Zimbabwe? Well, I don't know. My friends were organizing a protest and an election. This was even before I knew that I would write this book. But most parents are remitting caution, not just to their children, but to their families. If I am giving you money, then why would you want to participate in something that could lead to violence? So that's the other thing that remittances are doing, right? It's not to say that people shouldn't send, but it's just to show you that the trajectory of the money, right? And then, so I finished the dissertation. I've written about the exit. Now I've got this tenure track job, and I need to get tenure because that's how you survive in academia. And it's not enough to write a book that mirrors your dissertation. You have to add something else. So I think of two people. I think of the mother who was not sending the grandchild to private school because she had 5 other children to take care of. And it so happened that I was back home and I was visiting my young sister's grave. And I noticed that her grave, when she died, she was 23. So she would have been with the adults. But the graves for the very small children and the adults were coming closer and closer together. Traditionally, those two should be separate, right? So I do the very anthropological thing that I had learned, take out my notebook, and I take note of the age groups of who's dying, right? Who's being buried. The story in Zimbabwe is that young people are dying, right? So the profile of those who support the opposition is young, educated, urban. The profile of those who are leaving the country, young, educated, urban. The profile of those who die, young, educated, urban. The biggest cause of death in Zimbabwe was the HIV crisis. Most people write about HIV as a rural illness. It wasn't. It was a disease that began in the urban areas. You get sick in the urban areas, you might die in the rural areas. Before ARVs, people are just dying. In the book, I write about how my cousins and I were now spending a lot of time together because we were constantly at funerals, right? So that grandmother, those 5 orphans, with 2 of her adult children educated who died of HIV. She tells me about a support group for grandparents who are raising orphans. I interviewed this grandfather who's raising 12 orphans. He raised his 8 children. They were all educated. They all went to university at the University of Zimbabwe. They all had middle-class lives. They all died from HIV. Right? What does it mean that a small country that has just gained independence loses almost 2 million people from HIV? 40 million people were impacted by HIV. 36 million of those people were in Southern Africa. Right now, we're talking about the impact of PEPFAR. I've got a project that I'm working on for the Bush Foundation, where we're looking at what are the wins and gains for PEPFAR. And it's a really hard year to be doing that as we are thinking about how the world would regress back to before we had medication. But in Zimbabwe, the story tells itself, right? So all of these people that died, and I was able to get really good data because then the question for people was, well, you can interview immigrants, but you can't interview dead people. How are you going to tell us how they would have voted? So I do some good statistical things where I overlay the numbers of those who died in urban areas to see how their participation would have impacted across the board, right? So ZANU-PF supporters were dying, opposition supporters were dying, but the majority of those who were dying were in urban areas. And even in 2005, we get Operation Cleanup, right? So remember, as a kid, I attend this rally where the government is talking about demolishing houses. In 2005, they actually do it. And their argument is that urban centers are dirty. That is why you have HIV crisis. You're immoral. So we are going to clean up the city. In their Operation Cleanup, they also clean up access centers for HIV medication. 700,000 people are displaced. People often focus on them being displaced from their homes. Many of them are displaced from their access to HIV medication. So in the book, I write that HIV itself, it takes away a critical group of people, young people, the working age group, right? It takes them away from political participation, from participating in economic life. But there was another group that was dying. Before he passed, I had the joy of interviewing Oliver Mtukudzi, and I was asking him how his music had changed, because artists tend to be the pulse of a revolution. And for many of the artists of Oliver Mtukudzi's age, they were now singing about HIV. And I wanted to know why. Why aren't you necessarily singing about the decay of democracy? And he told me that at one point, he lost almost everybody in his band, right, to HIV. And so I look at all these artists, and there's another colleague of mine who does the same in Zambia, where we look at the death of artists, right? And so this is motivated by work that I had read that looked at the death of artists in the United States. How did the HIV crisis in the US change the work of art in the US? What would it look like if we hadn't lost those 100,000 artists in New York and San Francisco? There's also really incredible work that looked at how HIV deaths in the surrounding suburbs in Chicago changed voting patterns in Chicago. There's places that had been predominantly blue become red, right? Because all of these people were dying from HIV. And the same thing happens in Africa. Another group was dying, politicians were dying. So ZANU-PF politicians were dying, opposition politicians were dying, but it matters for democracy because each time an opposition MP died, their seat was replaced by a ZANU-PF official. The reason being that the opposition tends not to afford by-elections. They just don't have the economic resources to manage this. So anytime the opposition loses a seat because somebody has died, that seat goes to ZANU-PF. ZANU-PF loses people, they keep their seats, right? So all those gains that the opposition is making during those elections, they are lost because of death. So I think we have just maybe one or two seats that remained, right, with the opposition. And then something else with HIV is that I also got very interested in children learn about politics from their families. We see a mushrooming of orphanages, right? So I was interviewing people who grew up in orphanages, and I wanted to know, what did you know about politics? A lot of people are asking, why is the Gen Z in Zimbabwe not participating in politics, et cetera, et cetera? Number one, this is a generation that witnessed all this violence that we write about. There were children witnessing that, right? So that dampens political participation. But for the children that grew up in orphanages in particular, there's a unique dampening of engagement that would not have happened if they had grown up in their middle class homes, right? And I write a little bit about that, but I think that's work that somebody else can take forward. So in the end, what the book shows you is that because of these multiple ways that voters exit from the political process in Zimbabwe, for ZANU-PF, it was, imagine a pressure cooker. I don't cook, right? But those of you who do cook, imagine a pressure cooker and things are boiling. Ideally, you're not supposed to open the lid, right, for the things to cook. But Zimbabwe just gets a small opening, right, where people live. So I also followed some big numbers of people who left. There's a hospital that lost about 60 nurses and doctors overnight. So if you look on the book cover, so I designed this with a Zimbabwean artist, and it's very exciting. It says, we mentioned Hertfordshire because there are these small towns in England where nurses and doctors would leave a mass, right? You're trained in Zimbabwe, you could work in England easily. And so we're losing those nurses and doctors. Even when we talk about the shortage of doctors in Zimbabwe, I was just with our daughter in Victoria Falls, and I realized that there isn't a single pediatrician in Victoria Falls, not one. And this is a country that had many, 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 many doctors, right? So where else can we apply this? My favorite case to think about is Nigeria, where Nigeria has 90 million eligible voters. In almost every election, just about 30 million voters participate in elections, right? That's a huge number. Africa's largest country. What does it mean, right? I think a lot about places like Ethiopia, where a lot of people left, some went back. Positive cases, well, I don't know, my friends from Gambia are torn. But I thought it was a positive case in 2016 when Gambians went back to vote. I don't know, I hear the president has turned not so good. But people went back to vote, and that kicked out the dictator, right? So there are all these places. Since the start of the Ukraine war, about 5 million people have been forced to leave home. So when we think about what Ukraine looks like in the rebuild, right? I don't know if you spend a lot of time on social media. I do for work, but I was enjoying following influencers in England, British influencers in Dubai. Who left England because they didn't want to pay tax and they thought there were too many foreigners, so they moved to Dubai. And then unfortunately, the war came to Dubai, and now they must move back to England. And the British were saying, well, we can bring you back home, but you got to pay taxes before we bring you back, right? So, but also thinking about, well, what does it mean, right? This exit of taxes. I actually am very curious if these people that are going back from Dubai will be paying taxes because it matters, right? I don't know. I sound very pro-tax here, but I'm like, well, you kind of left, went to Dubai. But that is the book. I love talking to academics because I hope you read it, you write reviews, positive, negative. It's all part of the academic game. But I really want to know what you think, any questions that you might have. It was such a stress. I was going to say joy, but it wasn't joy. It was very stressful to write the book, and I'm very glad that it's now out. Thank you so much.